The first time Darren Voss left food outside the ruins of Hangar 7, he told himself it was guilt. He'd been doing perimeter checks since the Kethavar landed. That was what the brass called it, a landing, as if something the size of a small mountain gently settling into the Nevada basin qualified for so polite a word. The shockwave had flattened 4 towns. The electromagnetic pulse had knocked out a grid covering 3 states. And the crater where Hangar 7 used to stand had become a kind of exclusion zone within the exclusion zone, a place where even the Kethavar scouts didn't go, and neither, officially, did anyone from the Joint Coordination Office. Darren went anyway. He was a xenobiologist attached to the JCO, which in practice meant he was the only person on the base who admitted to being curious rather than terrified. His clearance was high enough to walk the perimeter and low enough that no one important tracked his movements. That combination suited him fine. He'd spent 11 years cataloging extremophile bacteria in deep ocean vents and hydrothermal plumes, the kind of work that got you comfortable in silence and rubble and places the light didn't reach properly. Hangar 7, with its buckled steel frame and its half-collapsed roof, and the thin blue-white mist that drifted off the Kethavar ship's secondary exhaust vents 2 kilometers north, felt like field work. He could pretend it was field work. It was on his 3rd visit that he found the scrape marks. Low on the eastern wall, below what remained of a window frame, something had been pressing against the outside of the building and scratching at the concrete, not violently, not like a predator marking, but repeatedly in the same spot at roughly the same height. He knelt and measured with his hand. The marks were about 1 meter off the ground. Small, made by something that came back more than once. He came back the following morning with a container of protein slurry from the JCO's xenobiology lab, a nutrient-dense paste they used for biological sample testing, human-safe, broadly caloric. He set it at the base of the wall next to the scratch marks. He walked away and sat in his truck 200 meters north and watched through binoculars until his hands went numb. Nothing came. He came back the next morning, and the container was empty. That was how it started. He didn't tell anyone. There were good operational reasons not to. The JCO's current doctrine on Kethavar-adjacent contact was withdraw and report, which was another way of saying don't. But the honest reason was simpler. The thing making those scratch marks was hungry. It was small enough to be frightened of him, and it had come back twice. Those 3 facts together felt like something delicate that a protocol meeting would crush. He brought more food the following day, protein slurry and a brick of compressed grain rations. He set them at the wall and sat in his truck and waited. The morning light came up slow over the basin, the kind of flat gray light that made everything look provisional, and then the mist from the Kethavar ship shifted and turned the air faintly violet, and something moved at the edge of the hangar's eastern wall. He watched it through the binoculars and made himself breathe. It was small, smaller than he'd imagined from the scratch marks, perhaps 1.5 meters on its back legs, though it was moving in a crouch that compressed its frame significantly. Its skin was the color of old graphite, mottled with faint bioluminescent patches along the spine that pulsed irregularly, like a faltering heartbeat. 6 limbs total, 2 legs, 4 arm variants of varying length, the longest pair folded against its torso at rest. Its head was elongated, tapered at the jaw, and it moved with the cautious, economical motion of something accustomed to being the smallest creature in a dangerous room. It reached the food, it stopped, it looked directly at his truck. The binoculars were powerful enough to show the eyes wide, gold green, the pupils vertical and currently expanded to near full in the dim light. It looked at him for a long time. Then it looked at the food. Then it picked up the protein container in its 2 smallest arms, pressed it against its chest, and retreated back into the hangar. Darren sat in the truck and didn't move for 20 minutes. He came back the next day and the day after that. On the 4th day, the creature didn't wait in the hangar. It was already at the wall when he arrived. It watched him get out of the truck. It watched him walk the 200 meters. He didn't hurry. He set the containers down, stepped back 5 paces, and sat on a chunk of fallen masonry with his hands on his knees. The creature approached. It picked up the food. This time it didn't retreat. It crouched 3 meters away from him and ate, watching him while it did, the bioluminescent patches along its spine cycling through pale colors he had no framework to interpret, amber, then green, then a deep bruised blue. The motion of eating was efficient and without pleasure, the movement of a body fueling itself because it needed to, not because it wanted to. There was something in that Darren recognized from his own worst years. He said quietly, "Okay, same time tomorrow." The creature went still at the sound of his voice. Pulse patterns on its spine shifted sharply to a flat, cold white. Then slowly, they faded back to amber. It left without hurrying. He came back the next day, and the next. By the 3rd week, he understood that there were 2 of them. The smaller one, the one that came to him first, was a juvenile. It took him longer to figure this out than it should have, because the mother had been watching him the entire time and he hadn't known. She was larger, better camouflaged, and she had chosen a position in the shadow of a collapsed steel beam on the hangar's south side from which she could observe the eastern wall without being visible. He found the spot by accident on his 14th visit, when the angle of the early light changed, and caught the edge of a bioluminescent patch he shouldn't have been able to see. He sat very still when he found it. She didn't run. She watched him from her position in the shadows with an absolute stillness that suggested she was prepared for a great number of outcomes and had resigned herself to all of them. Her frame was larger than her daughter's. He'd started thinking of the juvenile as female. He wasn't sure why. Something in the way she moved suggested the word, but both of them were thinner than they should be. The mother especially. The patches along her spine were dim, barely cycling, like a battery in its last few percent. He went back to his truck and came back with every food container he had. He set them at the eastern wall, as usual. He set the extra ones at the collapsed steel beam, in the shadow, in the place where the mother had been. Then he went and sat on his chunk of masonry and waited. The juvenile came first, fed, moved aside. Then the mother came out. She was tall, easily 2.5 meters when she straightened, though she didn't straighten fully, moving with a forward lean that might have been habit or injury. Her coloring was darker than her daughter's, the bioluminescent patches muted and widely spaced, and there was a long healed scar across the left side of her torso that had disrupted the pattern of light organs there, leaving a dark swath like a gap in a star field. She moved to the food containers with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with hunger management. She was hungry enough that her body was shaking, fine tremors in the longest pair of arms, and she was still moving with a kind of careful control that Darren had seen in human beings after disasters. The specific, effortful dignity of someone refusing to fall apart in front of another person. He looked away while she ate, seemed like the right thing to do. When he looked back, she was watching him. He held her gaze and said nothing. After a moment, he picked up the empty container the juvenile had left near him and set it in a neat stack to his right. Then he put his hands back on his knees and sat there. The mother's spine patterns shifted. He'd been watching long enough now to have begun, tentatively, to build a vocabulary. The amber he'd started to associate with something like alert calm. The green appeared during the juvenile's more exploratory behaviors, curiosity, maybe, or something adjacent to it. The cold white was fear-freeze. He was almost certain. This color now was something he hadn't seen before, a warm pale gold that moved slowly from the base of her spine toward the crown of her head and then faded. He didn't have a word for it yet. She went back into the hangar. The juvenile lingered for a moment, looked at him with the gold-green eyes, and then followed her mother. Darren sat in the basin in the thin early light, and the Kethavar ship glittered 2 kilometers north, and somewhere inside the wreckage of Hangar 7, A mother and her child existed in a broken place between worlds. He sat there for a long time. Then he drove back to base and wrote nothing in any official report. The JCO held its bi-weekly briefing on a Thursday. Darren sat in the back row. The intelligence officer on the screen talked about Kethavar communication patterns, possible territorial designations, the likelihood of additional vessels. The military attaché talked about force projection capabilities and deterrence thresholds. The xenolinguistics team showed a graph of phoneme frequencies that still didn't add up to anything interpretable. Nobody talked about the ruins of Hangar 7. Darren ate his lunch at his desk afterward and thought about the mother's shaking arms. He'd been reading whatever xenobiology literature existed on long-duration caloric restriction, which, for a non-human species, was essentially nothing, and cross-referencing it with what he'd observed. The juvenile appeared to be recovering. She moved more fluidly each day, and the bioluminescent patches had brightened noticeably in the past week. The mother was not recovering at the same rate. She was eating what he brought, but whatever she'd been through before he found them had taken something structural, something that food alone wasn't replacing. He didn't know what to do about that. He was a xenobiologist, not a physician, and even if he had been a physician, he had no framework for her physiology. What he had was a background in organisms that survived extreme environments by adapting their metabolism in radical ways. And what that background told him was that an organism under extended caloric stress would begin to cannibalize its own tissues in a specific order, and that the order mattered, and that some damage didn't undo itself. He sat at his desk and looked at his hands for a while. Then he pulled up his access to the base medical supply and started reading labels. On his 22nd visit, he brought a crate. The juvenile came immediately. She'd stopped holding back now, greeting him with a directness that had started to feel like its own kind of communication. She approached within arm's reach, which she'd never done before. He held very still. She examined the crate with her two smallest arms, and the spine patterns ran through amber-green amber in what he'd come to think of as investigation mode. He opened the crate. Inside, alongside the usual food supplies, were 6 sealed medical containers, broad-spectrum nutrient concentrates synthesized for bioavailability, plus a compound that in human medicine was used to support cellular repair in malnourished patients. He'd had to improvise. He had no idea if any of this was metabolically compatible. But the concentrates were based on molecular structures common across carbon-based life, and the repair compound was designed to be inert in incompatible systems, and he'd spent 3 days running every analysis he could without a sample. He set the containers on the ground and stepped back. The juvenile sniffed them and lost interest. They didn't read as food to her. He waited. The mother came out. She was moving worse today. The shaking in the long arms had extended to the upper torso, and she was holding herself with a careful rigidity that suggested the tremors were worse than they looked. She came to the containers and stopped. She picked up one of the medical containers, turned it in her small arms, and held it close to her face for a long time. Darren said very quietly, "I don't know if it helps. I don't know enough to know, but I made the best guesses I could." She looked at him. He'd stopped being surprised by these direct looks. She was intelligent. He'd stopped hedging that word sometime in the second week, and she understood more about this exchange than he did, probably. She'd been watching him from the shadows since before he knew she existed. She'd calculated something and arrived at a conclusion and was acting on it. He was just the human on the other end of a negotiation he hadn't known he was in. She opened the medical container and consumed it with the same effortful discipline she brought to everything. He came back the next day with more. It was the juvenile who first crossed the invisible line. Darren had been sitting on his piece of masonry. He'd brought a folding camp chair by this point, which felt like a small but significant admission that this was going to take a while, when the juvenile came out of the hangar and instead of stopping at the food containers kept walking toward him. She stopped 2 meters out. 1 meter. She was at arm's length and he sat still and let her look. She reached out with the smallest of her 4 arms and touched his wrist. Not a grab, not a test of strength, just a touch, the flat of 2 small finger analogs resting on the inside of his wrist where the pulse was. She held it there for a moment. The spine patterns ran a slow cycle through green, gold, green. He thought, she's checking if I'm alive the same way I'm alive. He said very carefully, hello. She pulled her hand back. She tilted her head, the same head tilt the mother sometimes did, which he'd come to think of as something between a question and a recalibration. Then she went to the food containers and ate with a focus that suggested the interaction was filed away, complete, and she had moved on. He looked down at his wrist where she'd touched him. His hands were not usually the kind that shook. They were steady hands, the kind that had spent years handling fragile specimens and delicate equipment. They were steady now. But there was something happening in his chest that was not steady at all, something he didn't have a scientific name for, and he sat with it for a while before he picked up his coffee thermos and took a long drink and told himself to get it together. He told the juvenile, "Your mother's getting better." She looked at him over her food container. "I've been trying to figure out what's missing," he said. "I have some ideas. I'm going to need you to tell me if I'm wrong." She held his gaze for a moment, then she went back to eating. He came back the next day. On the 31st day, the mother spoke to him. He hadn't expected language. He'd known the Kethavar were communicative. The linguists at the JCO had recordings of what they believed were speech patterns, but he'd been operating under the assumption that whatever communication happened between him and these two would remain in the register of body language and proximity and exchanged objects. He was in his camp chair. The juvenile was exploring the perimeter of the clearing in a pattern he'd started to think of as play, widening circles, pausing to examine objects, returning to check his position. The mother was sitting 3 meters away, eating. The sound she made was low and complex, not a single phoneme but a layered chord of them, produced by a respiratory system that was clearly doing several things simultaneously. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then she stopped and looked at him. He said, "I don't understand." She made the sound again, slightly different. Then she pointed, a gesture he recognized from the first week, when she'd started using the long arms to indicate direction at the juvenile. He said, "She's okay. I think she's doing well." The mother made a different sound, shorter, lower. He thought about it for a long time, then he said, "I think that might be yes, but I don't know." The spine patterns ran slow amber. She went back to eating. He sat in his camp chair with his coffee and the pale violet light, and the sound of the juvenile investigating a collapsed wall segment 30 meters away, and he thought, "We are building something here. I don't know what it is yet, but it's being built." He'd been at this for 43 days when the JCO finally flagged the hangar. It wasn't his visits that triggered it. It was a drone that had caught a thermal signature inconsistent with the ambient ruins. Standard sweep, automated analysis, and then a note to his supervisor, Dr. Celeste Huang, who called him into her office on a Wednesday morning with the kind of expression that meant she'd already decided not to be angry, but was reserving the right. "Hangar 7, she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the drone report. She looked at him. 2 signatures, one large, one small, not human. "No." "How long?" 43 days. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office window, the base moved through its morning routines. Trucks, people, the distant outline of the Kethavar ship catching the early sun. "You've been feeding them," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And they haven't." "No," he said. "Nothing. They've been there in hiding, Celeste. They're not scouts, they're not advanced elements, they're not anything tactical. They're a parent and a child who got separated from whatever they were and ended up in a ruined building in the middle of a desert. Huang looked at him for a long time. She had 20 years on him and had spent most of them in situations like this one, where the careful protocols and the correct doctrine and the thing that was obviously right were all pulling in different directions, and her face had the particular set of someone who had learned to take her time with those moments. "What are they?" she asked. "I don't know yet. I don't think they're Kethavar or not central to whatever the Kethavar are doing. The Kethavar don't go near the hangar. Whatever happened to put them there, I don't think the Kethavar want them back." That could mean they're dangerous. It could mean a lot of things. Another silence. Then Huang said, "Show me the data." He spent the next 4 hours walking her through everything. The physical observations, the behavioral progression, the medical interventions he'd attempted, the communication fragments he'd started logging. She listened with the complete attention she brought to anything that might matter and asked precise questions at precise moments. And at the end of it, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. "You know, I can't file this internally without it going to the security committee," she said. "I know. And the security committee will want to extract them." "I know that too." She looked at him. "What do you want to happen, Darren?" He said, "I want to bring them here. I want to give them somewhere that isn't a ruin." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a significant thing." "Yes." "They'd have to agree." "Yes." "And you think they would?" He thought about the mother's shaking arms, and the juvenile's touch on his wrist, and the warm, slow gold that moved along a spine in the thin desert light. He thought about 43 mornings in a camp chair in the rubble of Hangar 7, and what it meant that he'd been able to sit that close to something that frightened him a little every day, and have it choose to come closer anyway. "I don't know," he said. "I think I can ask." He drove out to the hangar that evening, which he didn't usually do. The mornings were their time, established early and maintained, and he was reluctant to disrupt the pattern. But he needed to see them. The juvenile came out of the shadows almost immediately, which meant she'd heard the truck and recognized it. She stopped at arm's length and ran through the investigation cycle, amber, green, amber, and then looked at him with the direct gold-green eyes. He said, "I need to talk to your mother." The juvenile tilted her head. Then she made a sound, small, precise, directed back into the hangar. A call. The mother emerged a few minutes later. She was moving better than she had been. The tremors in the long arms were gone, though she still carried herself with the careful rigidity of someone who'd learned not to trust their own body completely. She came to her usual position and looked at him. He said, "There are people I work with who know about you now. I couldn't keep it from them indefinitely, and trying would have made it worse. The ones who know, my supervisor, she's not going to send people with weapons. But this place isn't safe for much longer. More people will find you." The mother's spine patterns shifted, the flat white of fear freeze beginning. He said, "I have a place. It's not perfect. It's a base, a human base. There are people there. But there's space, and there's food, and there are walls that aren't falling down." He stopped. He felt the inadequacy of language in a way that was not about the language barrier. "I know I can't explain what I'm asking. I know you don't know what I'm offering. But I've been here every day for 43 days, and I've never brought anything but food, and I'm asking you to trust that." Silence, the violet light from the north, the juvenile standing at his elbow. The mother looked at him for a long time. Then she made a sound he hadn't heard before. It was short, simple, 2 tones resolving into a third, and she looked at her daughter, and her daughter made the same sound back. He didn't know what it meant. But the mother's spine patterns had shifted to the warm, pale gold, the slow, moving gold that started at the base and traveled upward, and something about that color in the fading evening light was the closest thing to an answer he thought he was going to get. He said, "Okay, tomorrow morning. I'll be here at the usual time." He drove back to base and sat in his truck in the parking lot for a while before he went inside. They came. He'd briefed Huang and she'd cleared a section of the old storage wing ground floor. External windows, no cameras, no personnel assigned. She'd moved the paperwork through channels that didn't quite connect to each other, the way she'd been moving paperwork for 20 years. And what it meant in practice was that there were 2 rooms at the end of a corridor that had been quietly stocked with food, with clean water, with bedding materials of several types. Darren drove to Hangar 7 at the usual time, and they were waiting for him at the eastern wall. Both of them, standing in the pale gray light. The mother had the juvenile's hand, the small arm equivalent in her own, and they stood together with a stillness that was different from the watchful stillness of the past weeks. This one had the weight of decision in it. He said, "Ready." He walked to the truck. He opened the passenger door. He sat in the driver's seat and waited. The juvenile came first. She climbed into the truck with the exploratory confidence she'd developed over the past weeks, examining the interior with the systematic amber-green attention. And then she settled into the passenger footwell because the seat was clearly wrong and the floor was more sensible. The mother came after. She was too large for the cab. She stood by the open passenger door for a moment, and then she folded herself with enormous, careful precision into the rear cargo space. 4 long limbs arranged with the geometric economy of someone accustomed to fitting into spaces that weren't made for them. Darren drove slowly, and the desert went past, and the violet light from the Kethavar ship caught the dust from the tires and turned it briefly something other than dust. There is a version of this story where the base reacted badly, where the security committee overruled Huang and the rooms at the end of the storage corridor were replaced with a containment cell, and everything that had been built over 43 mornings was undone in a day. That version didn't happen, partly because of Huang, who was very good at paperwork and even better at timing. Partly because the first person they encountered in the corridor was a PFC named Tors, who was 22 years old and had grown up feeding stray cats, and who looked at the juvenile with her gold-green eyes and said, "Oh," in the way people say it when something gets past their defenses before they can get those defenses up. Partly because the mother, entering the storage wing corridor with her careful folded limb gait, saw Tors freeze, and she did something Darren had never seen her do before. She stopped. She held herself still for a moment. Then she made the short 2-tone sound, the one from the night before, the one her daughter had echoed back, and she looked at Darren. He said, "Tors, this is," and stopped, because he didn't have names for them. He had designations in his notes. He had the daughter and the mother. "They don't have names, I know," he said. "I've been calling her." He looked at the juvenile. "I've been calling her Myra in my head. I don't know why. It fit." Tors said, "Hi, Myra." The juvenile looked at Tors with the full-attention gold-green stare. Then she made a small, precise sound, and the spine patterns ran green. Curiosity, definitely curiosity. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not a smooth upward line of progress. They were the kind of weeks that come after a decision that was right but complicated, full of difficult moments and unexpected reversals, and the occasional crisis that turned out to be smaller than it looked, and the occasional small thing that turned out to matter enormously. The mother was unwell for longer than Darren had thought. The physical recovery continued, but there were days when she didn't come out of the inner room, and on those days the juvenile sat at the door and made a sound Darren couldn't parse, and he sat in the corridor outside and worked on his notes and didn't push. Some things needed time that no compound he could synthesize would replace. He had a name for her by the 3rd week. He hadn't planned it. He'd been watching her one morning manage a situation where 3 different base personnel had come to look at them, a common occurrence now, cautiously managed by Huang's informal protocols, and she had handled the attention with a patience and a precision that reminded him of something, and the word that came to him was Ilara. Systematic, he'd thought. Ilara. He'd said it once by accident, talking to himself. She'd looked at him. He'd said, "That's what I've been calling you, in my head, Ilara." The spine patterns had done the warm, slow gold. He wasn't sure what that meant. He'd been building a vocabulary for nearly 2 months, and there were still colors he didn't fully understand. But the gold felt like acknowledgement, and acknowledgement felt like enough. Myra learned faster than anyone expected. By the 6th week, she had a working understanding of spoken English. Not fluent, not comprehensive, but functional for concrete situations. Darren suspected she'd been building a passive vocabulary since the first day he'd spoken to her in the rubble, filing words, and testing them against context with the systematic patience of an organism whose survival had always depended on understanding its environment better than its environment understood it. The first word she used was more. He'd been setting out food. She'd said it clearly without preamble, watching his hands. More. He'd looked at her, he'd said more. She'd said, "More, please." He'd stood very still for a moment, then he'd said, "Yeah, absolutely." More. He'd gone and gotten more food, and she'd eaten it, and the spine patterns had run a long, steady amber green that he'd never been able to fully translate, but had come to associate with something like satisfaction. He'd sat down in his chair and told himself very firmly that the thing happening in his chest was just a normal human response to a novel cognitive event, and had absolutely nothing to do with the specific words she'd chosen to add. Please. He'd spent 3 weeks learning to not look away from a parent who was too hungry to feed herself properly. He'd spent 6 weeks showing up whether anything went right or not. He'd spent 40-plus mornings in a ruined building because someone was making scratch marks on a wall in a place where the light came in wrong. She'd learned please. He came back the next morning, and every morning after. The breakthrough, if that was the right word for it, and he wasn't sure it was, came on a Tuesday in the 3rd month. He was in the storage wing reviewing a new batch of nutrient compounds when Ilara came into the room. She'd started moving freely through the building by this point, accompanied always by 1 or 2 of the base personnel who'd been incorporated into what had become an informal watch rotation. Not surveillance, more like the unconscious companionship that develops when a community decides that something matters to it. She came into the room and she looked at him and she said, in a voice that was low and layered, and used his language the way water finds the shape of the vessel it flows into. "I want to understand what you are doing." He looked at her. "The compounds," she said. She indicated the containers with the long arms. "What they do, why you make them." He said, "I'm trying to help your body repair something it stopped doing." A pause. The spine patterns were still, that rare complete stillness that meant she was processing something large. "I have been," she stopped. She made a sound in her own language, a short, frustrated exhale of something that wasn't finding words. Then, "I know what is broken in me. I have known for a long time. I did not think it could be repaired." He said carefully, "What is broken?" She told him. It took time, she didn't have all the words, and some of what she described required her to show him rather than tell him, pointing to structures along her torso, indicating systems by tapping specific bioluminescent patches in sequences. But he was a xenobiologist who had spent his life learning the logic of organisms, and the picture she was drawing was one he could partly read. And what it told him was that she had been through something that had disrupted the regulatory systems governing her bioluminescent structures, which were not merely decorative but integral to her physiological communication. With her environment, with her own body, possibly with her daughter in ways he hadn't fully appreciated. He said, "The dimming, the patches going dark." She said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" She said, "A long time, before we came here, before the landing." He sat with that. Before the landing meant she'd already been carrying this when everything else happened, when whatever sequence of events had deposited them in the wreckage of Hangar 7 had occurred. She'd been managing it alone, in hiding, while also managing her daughter's health and survival, in a ruined building in a desert on a planet that had no reason to welcome her. He said, "I want to try something, but I need you to help me understand your system well enough to not make it worse." She looked at him for a long moment, the warm, slow gold again, moving from the base of her spine up. She said, "All right." It took 5 weeks. There were days that didn't work, adjustments that went sideways, moments where the prudent thing would have been to stop and call it a failure and settle for good enough. He didn't stop. She didn't stop. They worked in a language built from his biochemistry training and her first-hand knowledge of her own physiology, and a shared willingness to sit in a room for hours and find words for things that had never been translated before. Myra became their translator, in a sense, not linguistically, but in the way that a young person who has grown up between two worlds develops an instinct for when communication is straining and what it needs. She would watch her mother and Darren together and sometimes interject a word or a gesture or a spine pattern mimicry that clarified things no one had asked her to clarify. She was doing it naturally, out of some intelligence that had apparently decided this situation was worth her investment. The compound he finally developed was based on a repair support mechanism used in human medicine for disrupted neural tissue, modified beyond recognition to fit what he'd learned about Ilara's regulatory structures. He had no idea if it would work. He'd been here before, with the first batch of medical containers left at the base of a wall in a ruined hangar, telling himself he was making the best guesses he could. He said that to her again, the morning he prepared the final version. He said, "I don't know if this works. I've done everything I can do, but I don't know." She said, "I know." A pause. She said, "You have always told me when you didn't know." That is, she stopped, the layered chord of her own language brief and soft. Then, "It matters that you said when you didn't know." He looked at her, he said, "I need you to be able to tell me if anything feels wrong, immediately, the moment anything feels wrong." She said, "Yes." He administered it in the same careful, practical way he'd approached every step of this, no ceremony, just attention. She sat with the particular stillness she brought to important things, and he sat across from her with his instruments and they waited together. Nothing felt wrong. The first indication that something felt right was subtle. A patch along her lower spine, one that had been dark since before he met her, brightened. Not much. A faint amber edge barely there. Myra, sitting in the doorway, made a sound. It was the two-tone sound. The one from the evening in the ruined hangar, the one the mother and daughter had exchanged the night before they came. He'd been trying to understand it for 3 months, and now, watching Myra look at her mother's spine with her hands pressed together and her gold-green eyes wide and bright, he thought he might finally know. Not yes, not acknowledgement. Relief. It wasn't a cure. He'd been careful to set that expectation and careful to manage his own. The disrupted patches didn't all return. Some of the dark swath of scar tissue from her old injury remained quiet. But the regulatory function reestablished itself over the following weeks, and the patches that had been dim and irregular steadied. And one morning she came to find him, and the warm, slow gold moved from the base of her spine to the crown of her head in one long, unbroken wave, and it was brighter than he had ever seen it. He sat in his chair and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Hi." She looked at him, she said, "Hi." A pause, the gold still moving. "Darren." He said, "Yeah." She said, "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "When you asked us to come here, you said this place is not perfect. You said there are people. You said there are walls that are not falling down." "That's right." She was quiet for a moment. The juvenile was somewhere down the corridor, talking to Tors, actual talking, full sentences now, in a voice that still had the chordal quality of her native speech, but was shaping itself around English with a fluency that made linguists who visited the base sit very still with their recorders. The building moved around them in its ordinary way. Outside, Nevada existed. She said, "I have been thinking about what you did not say." He said, "What didn't I say?" She said, "You did not say it would be safe. You did not say we would be welcome. You said walls that are not falling down." She paused. "That was honest." He said, "Yes." And now? And now he considered this. The security committee had filed 3 reports. The JCO had assigned a formal designation to the situation. There were people on the base who were uncomfortable with the presence of 2 Kethavar-adjacent beings, and those people were not wrong to feel complicated about it, and their discomfort was not going away. The world outside the base was not ready for this. The Kethavar ship still sat in the basin 2 kilometers north, and the situation was still unresolved, and nobody knew what came next. He said, "I still can't promise safe. I can't promise welcome. There are people here who are trying and people here who aren't sure yet, and that's probably not going to change fast." He met her eyes. "But I'm here. And Myra has Tors completely wrapped around one finger. And Huang she makes things work. That's what she does." Ilara was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I have a word in my language for what you have been doing." He waited. She made the sound, the 2 tones, the third. The same sound she'd made in the ruined hangar when she'd looked at her daughter and her daughter had looked back. The same sound Myra had made watching the amber edge return to her mother's spine. He said, "I've heard that word before. I've been trying to understand it." She said, "It is not one thing. It is," she thought for a moment. "In my language, it is what we say when something that was at risk of being lost has been found again, when the thing that was breaking has held." He sat with that. She said, "I have been using it about us, about Myra and me. Since the ruined place," a pause, "I have also been using it about you." He didn't say anything for a while. Outside the window, the Nevada light was doing the thing it did in the mornings, low and flat and making everything look provisional, and also, somehow, exactly what it was. The Kethavar ship caught it somewhere in the north. He said, "The first time I left food at that wall, I told myself it was guilt." She tilted her head, the question recalibration he'd been reading for 3 months. He said, "I work for people who are trying to figure out what your kind wants from us, and the answer is probably complicated and political, and none of it is going to be simple. But I kept coming back to Hangar 7 every morning because..." He stopped. He tried again. "Because you were there. And it mattered that you were there. And I didn't know why yet, but I knew it mattered." She said, "And now?" He said, "I know why." A pause, the gold moving. "Because you were hungry," she said. It was not quite a question. He said, "Because you were there and you were hungry and you kept coming back. And that's a kind of trust, and trust is..." He stopped. "It's the most human thing I know," he said. "It's what we do. We notice when something keeps coming back, and we try to be worth coming back to." Ilara held his gaze for a long moment. The light moved. Her spine patterns ran the long, warm gold from base to crown. She said, "I would like to continue to come back." He said, "Yeah. Me too." There is a version of the larger story still being written, the one about the Kethavar ship and the JCO and the political complications that don't resolve cleanly, and the world trying to figure out what the arrival of something not human means for what human means. That story is ongoing. It doesn't have an ending yet. This one does. It ends the way the small true things end, not with a resolution that solves everything, but with a morning that is better than the morning before it. Myra in the corridor teaching Tors the 2-tone sound and laughing, a new development, a sound like layered bells, when he got it slightly wrong. Huang in her office filing paperwork that described an ongoing xenobiological liaison situation, in language specific enough, to be accurate and general enough not to alarm anyone who didn't already know. Darren in the storage wing with a new batch of compounds and 43 empty food containers he'd never thrown away, stacked in the corner of his office in a tower that was obviously impractical and that he was never going to dismantle. And Alara in the room at the end of the corridor, sitting at the window watching the Nevada light, with the patches along her spine running amber-green gold in the morning. Alive, brighter than before. Still coming back. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Some things are built in the rubble of fallen places, in the thin early light, one morning at a time, between creatures who have no common language except the willingness to keep showing up. And those things, when they hold hard. Human beings have known this a long time. We keep relearning it, which is a kind of stubbornness, and stubbornness is, in the end, a kind of love. The bats, somewhere in the desert night, wheeled and dove and found what they were looking for by the sound of what came back. So did he.